Lena moved carefully through the forest, her boots sinking softly into the moss-covered earth. The air was thick with the scent of pine, damp soil, and morning mist. Shafts of early sunlight filtered through the canopy above, illuminating the forest floor in scattered patches of gold. Her camera strap hung securely over her shoulder, and her fingers hovered near the lens, ready to capture any fleeting moment of beauty. This was why she had come here, to find life in its rawest, purest form, far from the noise and chaos of the world she had left behind. For days, Lena had been camped near this hidden glade, where the trickle of a brook and the whisper of wind through the leaves made it feel untouched by time. It was rumored that animals often gathered here at dawn, when the world still belonged to them. She had spent hours hidden in the shadows, crouched low in the underbrush, her breath held as she waited for moments that might never come. A red fox darting through the ferns, a family of deer pausing to drink from the stream, the flash of a hawk's wings. These were the treasures she sought, fleeting glimpses of a world humans had long forgotten. That morning, she had risen earlier than usual, the chill of the night still clinging to her skin as she set out from her small camp. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant call of a bird greeting the new day. She moved slowly, deliberately, her movements honed from years of patience. Every step felt like part of a ritual, as though she were entering sacred ground. When she reached the edge of the glade, she stopped abruptly. Her heart stilled, and her breath caught in her throat. There, in the misty clearing before her, was something she could not have imagined. A small fawn lay curled up near the base of a tree, its legs tucked neatly beneath its body. Its soft, spotted coat rose and fell with each gentle breath, oblivious to her presence. What stunned Lena wasn't the fawn itself, but what lay beside it. A wolf. It was massive, larger than any wolf Lena had ever seen. Its coat a dark charcoal gray with streaks of silver running down its back. The wolf's head was resting on its paws, its amber eyes half closed, and it lay only a foot away from the fawn. At first glance, the scene looked impossibly peaceful, like something out of a fable. A predator and prey lying together as though they were companions, not enemies. Lena's pulse quickened, her photographer's instincts warring with her disbelief. She lifted her camera slowly, her movements so careful it felt as though even the forest might protest if she made a sound. Through the viewfinder, she studied them more closely. The fawn looked impossibly small next to the wolf, its delicate frame and wide, dark eyes the picture of innocence. The wolf, in contrast, exuded quiet power, its broad shoulders and sharp features unmistakably that of a predator. Yet its posture was relaxed, protective even, as though it were guarding the fawn instead of hunting it. For several minutes, Lena didn't move. She barely breathed. She knew wolves, had studied them in passing for her photography projects, and everything about this scene defied what she understood about their nature. Wolves were predators, efficient and merciless when survival demanded it. A fawn, especially one so young, would be easy prey. Yet here they were, lying side by side in the early light, as though no such rules existed in their world. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. How had this happened? Was the fawn orphaned, and the wolf had, for some inexplicable reason, chosen not to harm it? Was the wolf injured or old, unable to hunt, and had simply found itself sharing space with the fawn? Or was there something deeper, something she couldn't yet understand? She shifted slightly, angling her camera to capture the perfect shot. The soft click of the shutter felt deafening in the quiet, and for a moment, the wolf's ears twitched. Lena froze, her body tense as the wolf lifted its head. Its amber eyes locked onto hers, piercing and intelligent, as though it could see straight through her. She expected the wolf to rise, to bare its teeth, to vanish into the forest. Instead, it stared at her for what felt like an eternity, its gaze calm but unyielding. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she held perfectly still. Then, the wolf turned its head slightly, its attention shifting back to the fawn. It lay its head back down on its paws, as though dismissing her entirely. Relief flooded through Lena, but it was tinged with awe. She had never seen anything like this, and she doubted she ever would again. For hours, she stayed hidden, watching them. The fawn eventually rose to its wobbly legs, stretching its neck to nuzzle the wolf's side before lying back down. The wolf, for its part, seemed to accept this with stoic patience, moving only to shift its weight or adjust its position in the grass. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the mist began to lift, but Lena remained rooted to the spot, transfixed by the scene unfolding before her. When she finally pulled herself away, her legs stiff and aching, her mind was spinning. She had witnessed something impossible, something that no one would believe without proof. Yet she had proof. The photographs she carried were more valuable than anything she had ever captured. As she made her way back to camp, her thoughts raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an oddity of nature, but something far more profound. The bond between the wolf and the fawn, however fragile, felt sacred, and she couldn't help but wonder what it meant, not just for them, but for her. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now coming back. Over the next few days, Lena found herself returning to the glade, drawn as if by some invisible thread. She couldn't stop thinking about the wolf and the fawn, the impossible bond she had witnessed. Each morning, she would slip out of her tent before dawn, move carefully through the still dark forest, and take up her usual spot hidden behind a thick wall of brush. The pair would always be there, just as she left them. The fawn curled up in the grass or wandering clumsily nearby, and the wolf, Shadow, as she'd silently come to call him, keeping watch. What struck Lena wasn't just the wolf's gentleness, but the way he seemed to belong to the fawn, as though some invisible role had been handed to him and he had quietly accepted it. She watched as Shadow would rise, his movements slow and deliberate, to circle the clearing, ears flicking to every sound. The fawn, trusting and unaware of its natural vulnerability, would trail behind him in a wobbling line, its spindly legs always a step behind. One morning, she saw the fawn stumble as it tried to nibble at a patch of tall grass. Lena tensed, but Shadow, to her astonishment, turned back and nudged the fawn with his broad nose. Just once, gentle but firm, until it righted itself again. The moment was over in seconds, but it stayed with her. This was not a wolf merely tolerating a weaker animal. This was something deeper, something that reminded her of a parent's quiet patience. Each day, Lena watched their connection grow clearer. She saw how Shadow let the fawn sleep close to him at night, how he positioned himself between it and the open edge of the glade, as though shielding it from an unseen danger. The fawn, for its part, never seemed afraid. It stayed close to Shadow's side like a shadow of its own, trusting a creature it had every reason to fear. Lena couldn't help but feel changed by what she was witnessing. She had spent years documenting the wilderness, photographing predators with their kill, capturing survival as it was a constant battle of life and death. Nature was not cruel, but it was unforgiving. And yet here, before her, the rules had been bent into something she couldn't explain. She felt as though she were watching the world hold its breath, a brief truce between predator and prey that defied everything she thought she knew. When she wasn't in the glade, Lena found herself sifting through her photographs at camp. She looked at every frame of Shadow and the fawn, searching for clues. There were shots where the wolf's sharp amber eyes stared straight into the lens, calm but unreadable. Others where the fawn nestled against his thick fur, its tiny head tucked into his side. Lena wondered how it had all started. Had the wolf found the fawn and, for reasons unknown, chosen not to kill it? Or had they both been lost, orphaned by the same cruel twist of fate, and found solace in one another? The quiet of the forest had begun to feel alive with questions she couldn't answer. It was during one of these afternoons that Lena realized how much Shadow's presence had begun to seep into her thoughts. When she looked at him through the camera lens, she didn't see a predator anymore. She saw something lonely. The way he lay still as the fawn wandered, his head turning only when the little creature strayed too far, reminded her of someone keeping watch over something fragile, someone who didn't want to be alone anymore. It stirred something deep in her chest. Lena had spent so much of her life in silence, traveling from one wild place to the next, documenting beauty without ever letting herself feel it. She thought back to her father, who had taught her everything about nature. He used to say, "If you watch long enough, you'll see what you're meant to see." Lena had always thought that meant catching a rare shot or witnessing some fleeting moment. Now, she wondered if it was something bigger. By the third day, her observations were interrupted by signs of trouble. From her spot in the underbrush, Lena could hear faint echoes, men's voices in the distance, carried through the trees. Hunters! She stiffened, her fingers tightening around her camera. The fawn was grazing near Shadow, who lay stretched out, one ear twitching lazily. He heard the voices too, his head lifted, eyes narrowing toward the forest beyond the clearing. The air seemed to change, charged with something Lena couldn't name. Shadow rose to his feet, his size startling as he towered over the fawn, who trotted closer to him for reassurance. Lena watched as Shadow sniffed the air, his body still and tense. Her stomach knotted. He knew something was wrong. When the voices faded, Shadow lay down again, though he didn't relax. The fawn, oblivious, curled up against his side, safe for now. Lena exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. She knew what those voices meant. Hunters looking for Shadow. For years, the lone wolf had been a legend among locals, a prize that remained out of reach. Now, with whispers spreading of strange sightings in the woods, Lena feared Shadow's days of evasion were numbered. That evening at camp, Lena couldn't shake the unease. She stared at the darkening forest, knowing that everything she had been witnessing, this fragile, impossible bond, was balanced on the edge of something dangerous. She thought of Shadow, his quiet patience, and the fawn who seemed to trust him completely. How could something so beautiful survive in a world that would never understand it? Her chest tightened. If the hunters found them, there would be no mercy. She knew the laws of the wild. Shadow might not be afraid, but he was vulnerable in ways even he didn't realize. For the first time in her life, Lena felt the need to do more than observe. She wanted to protect them. Lena could feel it, the shift in the forest. What had once been a place of serenity now hummed with an undercurrent of tension, like a taut string waiting to snap. The animals, who usually carried on their lives oblivious to her presence, were skittish. Birds startled from branches at the smallest sound. Squirrels darted erratically through the underbrush, and Lena couldn't ignore the faint, distant echoes that had started to punctuate the forest calm. Men's voices, the low thud of boots, the occasional sharp crack of a gunshot carried on the wind. The hunters were closing in. On the fourth morning, Lena found the glade empty for the first time. Her stomach dropped as she crouched in her usual hiding spot, scanning the clearing with her camera lens, hoping against hope that Shadow and the fawn would appear, as they always did. But the patch of grass where they usually lay was trampled and cold, the silence heavier than ever. She rose slowly, her hands shaking. Had they already been found? No. If something had happened, she would have heard the disturbance. A gunshot, shouting something, yet the stillness felt ominous, as if the forest itself knew a storm was coming. Lena spent the rest of the day searching. She crept through thickets and skirted along the stream's edge, her camera forgotten and her thoughts consumed by worry. Every snapped twig made her flinch. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. It wasn't until late afternoon that she found them. At the edge of a ravine where the trees grew thick and the light struggled to pierce through, Lena spotted the familiar charcoal, gray figure of the wolf. Shadow was lying stretched across a bed of pine needles, his head lifted, watching her approach. Beside him, the fawn stood on its unsteady legs, nibbling clumsily at a cluster of leaves. Lena stopped several yards away, her relief overwhelming. "You're okay," she whispered, as if they could hear her. Shadow's amber eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second, Lena could have sworn there was recognition there, some unspoken understanding that stretched beyond instinct. He didn't move, didn't growl or turn away. He simply watched. The fawn, oblivious to everything except the safety it felt near the wolf, wandered closer to Shadow's side, and nestled against him. The sight should have reassured her, but it only deepened the ache in her chest. This wasn't sustainable. Shadow and the fawn had been lucky so far, but luck never held forever. Not in the wild, and especially not with hunters circling. Lena crouched, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, and raised her camera. She captured the moment, Shadow's quiet vigilance and the fawn's trusting innocence. But as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that these photographs would soon be all that remained of them. That evening, back at her camp, the sounds of trouble grew closer. Lena sat by her small fire, her knees drawn up to her chest, listening to the faint crackling of twigs in the distance. Voices drifted through the dark like a cruel echo of her worst fears. Tracks lead through here. Big wolf, heading toward the ravine. Must be Shadow. They say he's been acting strange. Lena's heart clenched. She wanted to scream at them to stop, to leave the forest and its creatures alone. But she knew how they saw Shadow. A monster, a threat, something to be conquered and erased. They would never understand what she had seen, what she had felt. The next morning, she made a decision. She wouldn't stand by and do nothing. Lena packed quickly, grabbing her camera, her notebook, and a small bag of supplies. She didn't have a plan, not really. Only a determination to protect the wolf and the fawn, no matter what it took. She followed the path to the ravine, praying they were still there. When she arrived, she found them exactly where she had left them. Shadow lifted his head as she approached, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't move. Lena stopped a few feet away and lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the dirt. "I don't know if you understand me," she murmured softly, her voice shaking. "But you need to move. They're coming for you." Shadow didn't react. The fawn nuzzled at his flank, its tiny tail flicking contentedly. Lena bit her lip, unsure what she had expected. Some sign that Shadow understood, that he would gather the fawn and disappear deeper into the wilderness. She let out a breath, feeling helpless and foolish. Suddenly, a sharp sound cracked through the trees. A gunshot, far away, but close enough to send a ripple through the forest. Shadow's head snapped up, his body rigid and alert. The fawn startled and pressed closer to him, its legs trembling. Lena's heart raced as she looked back over her shoulder. The voices were closer now. "They're coming," she said again, more urgently this time. Shadow rose to his feet, and Lena saw it. The tension in his body, the instinct to flee. But the fawn stayed frozen, its fear rooting it to the spot. Shadow turned, nudged the fawn once, then again, more forcefully, until it stumbled forward a few steps. Slowly, the two began to move, Shadow guiding the fawn toward the thicker part of the forest. Lena exhaled shakily, rising to her feet. She turned back the way she had come and began running, her thoughts frantic. If the hunters caught up, they'd find nothing. She could only hope Shadow and the fawn would keep moving, farther, deeper, to places where men wouldn't follow. The voices grew louder behind her, and she knew the hunters were close. For a split second, she considered leading them away, shouting, drawing their attention, buying Shadow time. But she couldn't risk making things worse. Instead, she ducked behind a thick tree and waited, holding her breath as the men passed. They were close. She could see their rifles, the furrowed brows of men determined to find their prize. When the sounds finally faded, Lena emerged, shaken but resolute. She couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. That night, as the fire crackled beside her, she stared into the flames, her mind racing. The hunters wouldn't stop. Shadow and the fawn couldn't hide forever. She had to do something. She had to save them, even if it meant putting herself in the middle of a fight she couldn't win. Lena could hear the hunters before she saw them. Muffled voices and heavy boots pressing through the forest, coming closer with every step. The tension in the air was suffocating. She crouched behind a thick wall of brambles, her breath shallow as she watched them move through the trees. There were 3 of them, rugged men with weather-worn faces and rifles slung over their shoulders. They spoke in low tones, their words hard and sharp like the click of their weapons. "Tracks are fresh here. We'll cut it off by the stream. They say it's just a wolf, but I've seen the size of those prints. Whatever's out here isn't normal. Don't matter. A wolf's a wolf. And we're getting it this time. Lena's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like the sound would give her away. She couldn't let this happen. Not now. Not after everything she had seen, everything she understood. Shadow wasn't just a wolf. He wasn't some monster terrorizing their cattle or lurking as a villain in their stories. He was more, and no one else could see it but her. Her camera weighed heavily against her chest as she slung it over her shoulder. She didn't think. She just acted. Rising from her hiding spot, she stepped onto the narrow trail right in front of them. Stop! The word was out before she could second-guess herself. The hunters froze mid-step, their faces hardening in surprise as they looked at her. One of them, a tall man with a grizzled beard, spoke first. "Who the hell are you?" Lena swallowed, her throat dry, but she forced herself to hold her ground. "You can't do this." Her voice wavered, but she steadied it. "You're looking for the wolf, right?" "Shadow." The man narrowed his eyes. "That's none of your business. Step aside." "It is my business," Lena shot back, louder now. "You don't know what you're doing. That wolf, he's not what you think. He's not a threat." The men exchanged skeptical glances. Another hunter, younger and wiry, scoffed. "Not a threat? Wolves are predators, lady. They kill livestock, they kill deer. And if they get too bold, they kill people. You think this one's special?" Lena pulled the camera from her neck, her hands shaking slightly as she flipped through her photos. "Look," she said, holding it up. "Look at this." The older man squinted at her screen as she flipped to the pictures. The ones of Shadow lying beside the fawn, his massive frame curled protectively around the fragile creature. The light had caught the gentleness in his eyes, the trust in the fawn's posture. It was undeniable. It was real. "That's a fawn," Lena said quietly. "And that's the wolf you're hunting. He's not killing it. He's protecting it. I've been watching them for days. He hasn't hurt a single creature. I don't know how or why, but this wolf isn't acting like a predator. He's different." The younger hunter let out a bark of laughter. "You've been sitting in the woods, watching a wolf babysit a deer? Lady, you need help?" The older man didn't laugh. His eyes stayed on the camera screen, his brows furrowed deeply. Lena saw the hesitation there, just a flicker of doubt, but it was enough. "You think this changes anything?" He muttered finally, but his voice wasn't as firm. "A wolf is still a wolf. Doesn't matter if it's playing nice with a fawn. That's unnatural." "Unnatural," Lena repeated, her voice rising. "What's unnatural is you coming out here with guns, deciding what deserves to live or die. You've told yourself stories about that wolf, about how dangerous he is because it's easier to shoot him than to understand him." The men stared at her, their faces unreadable. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, Lena wondered if she had pushed too far. "What's easier," she continued, softer now, "is thinking you know everything about the wild. But you don't. I've seen things here you wouldn't believe. That wolf isn't your enemy." The older hunter rubbed at his jaw, glancing at the others. "You say you've been watching it?" Lena nodded. "Every day. I've seen him keep that fawn alive, protect it. He's not attacking livestock. He's not hurting anyone. He's just living." She paused, looking between them. "If you kill him, you're killing something you'll never see again. You're killing a story worth telling." The silence stretched long and thin. The younger hunter shifted, clearly frustrated. "So what? You want us to let it go? We've been hunting that damn wolf for years. Maybe it's time you stopped." Lena shot back. "He's not the monster you think he is." The older man looked at her again, longer this time. Lena saw the conflict in his face. Years of instinct, pride, and tradition warring with what he'd just been shown. Finally, he exhaled heavily, the weight of the decision in his shoulders. "Let's go," he muttered, turning back toward the trees. "What?" the younger man blurted. "I said let's go," the older hunter repeated. "If she's telling the truth, then we leave it. We got better things to do than chase fairy tales." The other men hesitated, but one by one, they followed him, their boots crunching against the leaves as they moved back into the forest. Lena stood frozen, her chest heaving as she watched them disappear. She didn't relax until she could no longer hear their voices. Her knees threatened to buckle, But she didn't care. She had done it. For now, she had bought Shadow and the Fawn time. Turning back toward the ravine, Lena started walking, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. Somewhere in the trees, she knew Shadow was watching. She hoped he understood. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was fighting for them. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the forest felt heavier than ever as dusk began to settle. Lena moved quickly but carefully through the underbrush, her mind a blur of urgency and fear. The hunters had backed off for now, but she knew it was temporary. Their doubt would fade, their determination would return, and they would be back. Shadow and the Fawn didn't have much time. Her feet followed familiar paths, worn into her memory after days of moving between camp and the ravine. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the spaces between trunks darker than usual as the sun dipped lower. Lena forced herself to stay focused. She clutched her camera strap, her breathing steady, the only sound accompanying her the faint crunch of twigs beneath her boots. When she reached the ravine, Shadow was there, standing like a silent sentinel. His hulking frame blended seamlessly into the darkening surroundings, but Lena had no trouble spotting him. The Fawn, as always, was nearby, its small form curled against the roots of a wide tree, its sides rising and falling peacefully as it slept. For a moment, Lena paused, struck again by the strangeness of the scene. The wolf turned its head toward her, those amber eyes catching the last light of day, unblinking but calm. There was no aggression, no tension, only watchfulness, as though he was waiting for her to do something. "You have to move," Lena whispered softly, though she knew Shadow couldn't understand her words. "It's not safe here anymore." She wasn't sure why she felt the need to speak. Maybe it was to calm herself, to convince herself this would work. She crouched lower and took a step forward. Shadow's ears twitched, but he didn't move away. Lena swallowed hard, her voice shaking slightly. "They're coming back. You need to go somewhere they'll never find you. Deeper into the forest. Farther than they'll ever look." Shadow tilted his head slightly, his gaze holding hers for an impossibly long moment. Lena's heart thudded as she tried to interpret what she was seeing. It was a ridiculous thought, a wolf understanding a human, but it felt like something had passed between them. A silent agreement, fragile but real. The Fawn stirred then, lifting its head and blinking sleepily as it took in the world. It looked at Lena with the same calm trust it reserved for Shadow, and the weight of the situation pressed down on her chest. "Come on," she murmured. "Let's go." Slowly, deliberately, Lena turned and began walking. She didn't look back to see if they were following her. Not at first. Every instinct screamed at her to keep moving, to let the forest swallow her whole. Branches snagged at her sleeves and scraped her legs, but she didn't stop. Her pace was careful but steady, moving deeper into the wild, toward places she had only glimpsed in passing. After what felt like forever, Lena finally glanced over her shoulder. Shadow was there, his massive form slipping through the brush as effortlessly as a ghost. The Fawn trailed just behind him, its delicate frame wobbly, but determined as it followed its protector. Relief flooded through Lena, but she didn't let herself slow. The forest grew darker, denser. This was no longer familiar ground. Even Lena wasn't sure where she was leading them anymore. She just knew it had to be farther. Somewhere safe. Somewhere untouched. The hunters wouldn't follow her this deep. At least, she hoped they wouldn't. Shadow kept pace behind her, silent and sure-footed. Every so often, Lena could hear the Fawn stumble over roots or uneven ground, but Shadow would stop, nudge it forward, and continue on. Lena watched it out of the corner of her eye, unable to help the lump that formed in her throat. It was a strange and beautiful thing to witness, this unspoken care, this bond that shouldn't exist. Hours passed. The world had gone pitch black, save for the silver light of the moon filtering faintly through the canopy above. Lena's legs burned from exhaustion, but she didn't dare stop. Shadow moved without hesitation, his confidence in the dark a stark contrast to her human clumsiness. It occurred to her then how different they were. Him, a creature of instinct, and her, a stumbling intruder in his world. And yet, here they were, bound together by something she couldn't explain. Finally, Lena spotted it, a grove nestled between a cluster of ancient trees. It wasn't much, but it felt hidden, tucked so deeply into the forest that even the air seemed thicker, untouched by man. The ground here was soft, blanketed in ferns and moss. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in a forgotten fairy tale. "This is it," Lena whispered to herself, letting her pack drop to the ground. She turned back towards Shadow and the Fawn. The wolf had already stopped at the grove's edge, his gaze sweeping the space like he was assessing its safety. Satisfied, he stepped forward, his body relaxing as he circled once before settling onto the cool earth. The Fawn followed him, curling close to his side without hesitation. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't perfect. She couldn't promise this would keep them safe forever. But it was something. For now, they were hidden. For now, they had a chance. She lowered herself to the ground a few feet away, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. Shadow's amber eyes met hers one final time before he rested his head on his paws, his body rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. The Fawn was already asleep, safe beside its unlikely guardian. Lena stared at the pair for a long while, her thoughts swirling. She had done all she could. They were free now, deeper than anyone would think to search. The hunters wouldn't find them here. Not tonight, and hopefully not ever. She leaned back against a tree, exhaustion finally catching up to her. But her mind refused to rest. The bond between Shadow and the Fawn had saved them both, and maybe, just maybe, it had saved her too. The forest was quiet again. Safe. For now. Lena sat in the quiet of her camp, her fingers tracing absent patterns in the dirt as the fire flickered low beside her. The forest seemed to exhale around her, as if relieved to return to its natural state. For the first time in days, she felt alone, truly alone, without the weight of Shadow and the Fawn lingering in her peripheral vision. They were gone now, tucked deep into a corner of the wilderness where men would never find them. And yet Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The fire cracked softly, and she leaned back, staring up at the dark expanse of sky sprinkled with faint stars. She should have felt triumphant. She had done what no one else would. She had fought for them, bought them a chance, and led them to safety. But instead, there was a strange ache in her chest, something like longing. For days, Shadow and the Fawn had occupied her thoughts, her time, her heart. Now they were simply gone, vanishing back into the mystery of the wild, and all she was left with were the photographs. Pulling her camera from her bag, Lena thumbed through the shots she had taken. Each frame felt like a memory pressed between the pages of a book, intimate and fragile. There was the Fawn, curled up against Shadow's massive form, its tiny legs tucked under its spotted body. Another shot of Shadow, standing at the edge of the glade, his head turned slightly toward the camera as if he could see her even through the lens. A third of the wolf nudging the Fawn forward, guiding it with a quiet authority that still made Lena's throat tighten. She paused on the final photo she'd taken before leaving the grove. Shadow lying in the moonlit clearing, the Fawn nestled close, their bodies relaxed in a way that felt almost sacred. There was peace in that image, a kind of trust Lena hadn't thought possible between predator and prey. Looking at it now, she felt it again, that hum of something bigger than herself, a reminder that there were moments in this world that didn't belong to human understanding. The next day, Lena packed up her camp. It felt strange to take down the tent, to scatter the ashes of her fire, to erase the small signs of her presence in the forest. As she loaded her gear into her truck parked miles away, the emptiness gnawed at her. A part of her wanted to turn back, to hike through the trees and check on them, to know for sure they were still okay. But she couldn't. The wilderness was theirs now, as it should be. When she returned to town, it was like stepping back into another world. The quiet hum of the forest was replaced with the drone of cars, voices, and the low thrum of life going on as it always had. No one knew what she had seen, what she had experienced, and that, she realized, was how it was supposed to be. Shadow and the Fawn weren't a story for everyone to touch. They were a secret she had been lucky enough to witness. And yet, she couldn't stay silent. Sitting in her small, cluttered apartment a few days later, Lena opened her laptop and uploaded the photographs. She stared at them for hours, choosing carefully, selecting only the images that told the story without saying too much. The world didn't need every detail, every fragile moment. They only needed a glimpse, enough to make them stop and wonder. She wrote a short article to accompany the photos, keeping it simple and raw. A lone wolf and an orphan fawn, an unlikely bond in the heart of the wilderness. Predator and prey defying the laws of nature, surviving together in a world that should have pulled them apart. She didn't include locations or her name. There was no ego here, no desire for recognition. She just wanted the world to see it, to see them, and to question the stories they thought they knew about predators and prey. With a final breath, she clicked publish. The response was quiet at first. A few shares, a handful of comments filled with awe and disbelief. Then it began to spread. The photos rippled outward, carried by people who couldn't look away from the haunting beauty of what Lena had captured. Some called it a miracle. Others dismissed it as impossible, a trick of angles or luck. Scientists speculated about unusual animal behavior. Animal lovers shared the images endlessly, their captions filled with words like trust and kindness. But Lena didn't read most of it. She let the photos speak for themselves, and she let the forest hold the rest. Weeks later, when the noise died down and the world moved on, Lena found herself drawn back to the edge of the wilderness. She hiked deep into the forest, following no particular path, but feeling as though something was guiding her. When she reached the grove where she had left them, her heart ached to find it empty. There were no signs of Shadow or the Fawn, no tracks in the moss, no broken branches marking their passage. The place was quiet, untouched. She stood there for a long time, the wind rustling softly through the trees, sunlight dappling the ground at her feet. Maybe they were still out there, hidden even deeper in the wilderness where no one would find them. Maybe Shadow had moved on, and the Fawn had learned to survive. Or maybe, as all things in nature do, their story had come to an end. Lena would never know, and that was okay. Some stories weren't meant to have endings. Some were meant to live only in the hearts of those who were lucky enough to witness them. As she turned to leave, she felt the forest behind her, alive, vast, and full of secrets she would never uncover. She carried their story with her, knowing it had changed her in ways she couldn't explain. For a brief moment in time, she had seen something impossible, something that didn't belong to the rules of the world she knew. And in that small, fleeting miracle, Lena understood that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we can't fully understand, the ones that remind us there's still beauty, still mystery, still hope in a world that so often forgets. Lena sat on the balcony of her small apartment, a steaming cup of coffee resting on her knees as the city bustled noisily beneath her. Cars honked in traffic, people's hurried voices filled the air, and somewhere, far off, the faint hum of machinery buzzed like a constant heartbeat of modern life. It all felt distant to her now, a rhythm she no longer belonged to. In her hands, she turned over a small stack of photos, the ones that had stirred so much attention. But here, in the quiet morning light, they were something much more personal. The first photo was of Shadow, lying in the glade, his body relaxed but his eyes still so sharp and alive, watching her through the lens like he had seen straight into her heart. Then there was the Fawn, fragile, small, and trusting, nestled close to the wolf's massive frame, unafraid. Lena traced the edge of the final photograph with her thumb. It showed the two of them together, bathed in soft moonlight, a moment frozen in time that should never have existed, yet it did. She had returned from the forest weeks ago, but the images had never left her. The silence of that place, the connection she had seen, the weight of what she had protected, all of it lingered in her mind, more real than the noise surrounding her now. The world had reacted to her story, turning the photos into a viral mystery that no one could quite explain. Some people called it beautiful. Others thought it was unnatural, a strange glitch in the order of the wild. Scientists had theories. Perhaps the wolf had been injured and unable to hunt, or perhaps the fawn's instincts were broken after losing its mother. Everyone had an explanation, but none of them could see what Lena had felt standing in that grove. It wasn't just survival that had bound Shadow and the fawn together. It was something deeper, something fragile and beautiful that didn't need a reason to exist. It simply was. Lena set the photos aside and looked out at the horizon. The forest felt so far away now, yet its memory had rooted itself inside her like an ache she couldn't shake. She had spent so much of her life moving from one wild place to the next, documenting what she found with the cool distance of an observer. But this time was different. This time, she had been a part of the story. She had stood in the middle of something larger than herself, and it had changed her. Her father's words echoed in her memory. If you watch long enough, you'll see what you're meant to see. He had been right. For all her years chasing beauty and truth through the lens of a camera, she had never truly seen until that moment. Until Shadow and the fawn taught her that life was not just survival. It was connection. It was trust. The phone on her table buzzed with a notification, breaking her thoughts. Lena ignored it. She had spent too long letting the world pull her in 100 directions, demanding explanations and answers she didn't have. She didn't want to explain what had happened in the forest anymore because it wasn't something meant for everyone to understand. It belonged to her, to the wolf, to the fawn. It belonged to the wild. And yet, there was still an emptiness, a lingering question that tugged at her every day. Were they still out there? Had Shadow led the fawn deeper into the safety of the woods? Or had the harshness of nature finally caught up to them? She would never know, and maybe she wasn't meant to. Nature didn't provide closure. It simply moved forward, indifferent to the stories humans placed upon it. One weekend, unable to resist the pull any longer, Lena packed her camera and drove back to the edge of the forest. The roads were familiar, and yet she felt like a different person traveling them now. She parked in the same small clearing where her journey had started and stepped out, inhaling deeply as the scent of pine and moss wrapped around her like an old friend. The forest was still the same, timeless, vast, and unbothered by her presence. Lena hiked for hours, following the paths she had once walked with such purpose, though now she didn't expect to find anything. She was chasing a memory, a ghost of what had been, and yet, when she reached the grove where she had last seen them, her breath caught in her chest. The clearing was empty, save for the wind rustling through the trees. The earth was undisturbed, the moss soft and untouched. No tracks, no broken branches, just silence. For a long time, Lena stood there, her camera forgotten at her side. She didn't cry, didn't ache. Instead, she smiled faintly. They were gone, yes, but that didn't mean their story had ended. Maybe Shadow had led the fawn deeper still, far beyond where any human could follow. Maybe the fawn had grown strong enough to survive on its own, the wolf's silent guardianship fulfilled. Or maybe the forest had taken them both back into its embrace, as it always did in the end. Lena raised her camera and took one photo of the empty grove, a place where something extraordinary had once existed. She tucked the camera away and turned back toward the trail, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. As she made her way out of the woods, she realized that what mattered wasn't what happened to the wolf and the fawn. What mattered was that, for a brief moment, their bond had existed, and she had been there to witness it. It was a reminder that there was still magic in the world, still mysteries that didn't need answers. Back in the city, Lena returned to her life, but she carried that truth with her. She continued to photograph the wild, but now she looked for something different. She looked for connection, for moments where life bent the rules and showed her something unexpected. And in quiet moments, when the noise of the world faded, she would think of Shadow and the fawn, somewhere out there, still living, still trusting, still defying the world's expectations. It was enough. It would always be enough. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.